Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy by Joseph Schumpeter, 2nd edition, 1942-1947. Excerpts read by Jim Kelly. Chapter 13, Growing Hostility. The Social Atmosphere of Capitalism. From the analysis of the two preceding chapters, it should not be difficult to understand how the capitalist process produced that atmosphere of almost universal hostility to its own social order to which I have referred at the threshold of this part. The capitalist process, so we have seen, eventually decreases the importance of the function by which the capitalist class lives. We have also seen that it tends to wear away protective strata, to break down its own defenses, to disperse the garrisons of its entrenchments. And we have finally seen that capitalism creates a critical frame of mind which, after having destroyed the moral authority of so many other institutions, in the end turns against its own. The bourgeois finds to his amazement that the rationalist attitude does not stop at the credentials of kings and popes, but goes on to attack private property and the whole scheme of bourgeois values. The bourgeois fortress thus becomes politically defenseless. Defenseless fortresses invite aggression, especially if there is rich booty in them. Aggressors will work themselves up into a state of rationalizing hostility. Aggressors always do. No doubt it is possible, for a time, to buy them off, but this last resource fails as soon as they discover that they can have it all. But, so it might well be asked, in fact, so it is being asked in naive bewilderment by many an industrialist who honestly feels he is doing his duty by all classes of society, why should the capitalist order need any protection by extra capitalist powers or extra rational loyalties? Can it not come out of the trial with flying colors? Does not our own previous argument sufficiently show that it has plenty of utilitarian credentials to present? Cannot a perfectly good case be made out for it? And those industrialists will assuredly not fail to point out that a sensible workman, in weighing the pros and cons of his contract with, say, one of the big steel or automobile concerns, might well come to the conclusion that, everything considered, he is not doing so badly, and that the advantages of this bargain are not all on one side. Yes, certainly. However, all that is quite irrelevant. For first, it is an error to believe that political attack arises primarily from grievance and that it can be turned by justification. Political criticism cannot be met effectively by rational argument. Capitalist rationality does not do away with sub- or super-rational impulses. It merely makes them get out of hand by removing the restraint of sacred or semi-sacred tradition. In a civilization that lacks the means or even the will to discipline and to guide them, they will revolt. So capitalism stands its trial before judges who have the sentence of death in their pockets. They are going to pass it, whatever the defense they may hear. The only success victorious defense can possibly produce is a change in the indictment. Utilitarian reason is in any case weak as a prime mover of group action. In no case is it a match for the extra-rational determinants of conduct. Second, the success of the indictment becomes quite understandable as soon as we realize what acceptance of the case for capitalism would imply. Rational recognition of the economic performance of capitalism and the hopes it holds out for the future would require an almost impossible moral feat by the have-not. That performance stands out only if we take a long-run view. Any pro-capitalist argument must rest on long-run considerations. In the short run, it is profits and inefficiencies that dominate the picture. In order to accept his lot, the leveler or the Chartist of old would have had to comfort himself with hopes for his great-grandchildren. In order to identify himself with the capitalist system, the unemployed of today would have completely to forget his personal fate and the politician of today his personal ambition. The long-run interests of society are so entirely lodged with the upper strata of bourgeois society that it is perfectly natural for people to look upon them as the interests of that class only. For the masses, it is the short-run view that counts. Third, there are the daily troubles and expectations of trouble everyone has to struggle with in any social system. The frictions and disappointments, the greater and smaller unpleasant events that hurt, annoy, and thwart. I suppose that every one of us is, more or less, in the habit of attributing them wholly to that part of reality which lies without his skin. An emotional attachment to the social order, the very thing capitalism is constitutionally unable to produce, is necessary in order to overcome the hostile impulse by which we react to them. If there is no emotional attachment, then that impulse has its way and grows into a permanent constituent of our psychic setup. Fourth, the ever-rising standards of life, and particularly the leisure that modern capitalism provides for the fully employed workman. Well, there is no need for me to finish the sentence or to elaborate one of the tritest, oldest, and most stodgy of all arguments which, unfortunately, is but too true. Secular improvement that is taken for granted and coupled with individual insecurity that is acutely resented is, of course, the best recipe for breeding social unrest. The sociology of the intellectual. Nevertheless, neither the opportunity of attack nor real or fancied grievances are, in themselves, sufficient to produce, however strongly they may favor, the emergence of active hostility against a social order. For such an atmosphere to develop, it is necessary that there be groups to whose interest it is to work up and organize resentment, to nurse it, to voice it, and to lead it. As will be shown in Part 4, the mass of people never develops definite opinions on its own initiative. Still less is it able to articulate them and to turn them into consistent attitudes and actions. All it can do is to follow or refuse to follow such group leadership as may offer itself. Until we have discovered social groups that will qualify for that role, our theory of the atmosphere of hostility to capitalism is incomplete. Broadly speaking, conditions favorable to general hostility to a social system or specific attack upon it will, in any case, tend to call forth groups that will exploit them. But in the case of capitalist society, there is a further fact to be noted. Unlike any other type of society, capitalism inevitably and, by virtue of the very logic of its civilization, creates, educates, and subsidizes a vested interest in social unrest. Explanation of this phenomenon, which is as curious as it is important, follows from our argument in Chapter 6, but may be made more telling by an excursion into the sociology of the intellectual. This type is not easy to define. The difficulty is, in fact, symptomatic of the character of the species. Intellectuals are not a social class in the sense in which peasants or industrial laborers constitute social classes. They hail from all corners of the social world, and a great part of their activities consist in fighting each other and in forming the spearheads of class interests not their own. Yet, these intellectuals develop group attitudes and group interests sufficiently strong to make large numbers of them behave in the way that is usually associated with the concept of social classes. Again, they cannot be simply defined as the sum total of all the people who have had a higher education. That would obliterate the most important features of the type. Yet, anyone who had higher education, and, save exceptional cases, nobody who had not, is a potential intellectual, and the fact that their minds are all similarly furnished facilitates understanding between them and constitutes a bond. Nor would it serve our purpose to make the concept coextensive with the membership of the liberal professions. Physicians or lawyers, for instance, are not intellectuals in the relevant sense unless they talk or write about subjects outside of their professional competence, which, no doubt, they often do, particularly the lawyers. Yet there is a close connection between the intellectuals and the professions. For some professions, especially if we count in journalism, actually do belong almost wholly to the domain of the intellectual type. The members of all professions have the opportunity of becoming intellectuals, and many intellectuals take to some profession for a living. Intellectuals are in fact people who wield the power of the spoken and the written word, and one of the touches that distinguishes them from other people who do the same is the absence of direct responsibility for practical affairs. This touch in general accounts for another, the absence of that first-hand knowledge of them which only actual experience can give. The critical attitude, arising no less from the intellectual situation as an onlooker, in most cases also as an outsider, than from the fact that his main chance of asserting himself lies in his actual or potential nuisance value, should add a third touch. If the monastery gave birth to the intellectual of the medieval world, it was capitalism that let him loose and presented him with the printing press. The slow evolution of the lay intellectual was merely an aspect of this process. The coincidence of the emergence of humanism with the emergence of capitalism is very striking. The humanists were primarily philologists who studied languages, but they quickly expanded into the fields of manners, politics, religion, and philosophy. How impossible it is to stem the tide within the framework of capitalist society is shown by the failure of the attempts, some of them prolonged and determined, made during that period by practically all European governments to bring the intellectuals to heel. In capitalist society, or in a society that contains a capitalist element of decisive importance, any attack on the intellectuals must run up against the private fortresses of bourgeois business which, or some of which, will shelter the quarry. Moreover, such an attack must proceed according to bourgeois principles of legislative and administrative practice, which no doubt may be stretched and bent, but will checkmate prosecution beyond a certain point. In defending the intellectuals as a group, not of course every individual, the bourgeoisie defends itself and its scheme of life. Only a government of non-bourgeois nature and non-bourgeois creed, under modern circumstances only a socialist or fascist one, is strong enough to discipline them. In order to do that, it would have to change typically bourgeois institutions and drastically reduce the individual freedom of all strata of the nation. And such a government is not likely. It would not even be able to stop short of private enterprise. From this follows both the unwillingness and the inability of the capitalist order to control its intellectual sector effectively. The unwillingness in question is unwillingness to use methods consistently that are uncongenial to the mentality shaped by the capitalist process. The inability is the inability to do so within the frame of institutions shaped by the capitalist process and without submitting to non-bourgeois rule. Thus, on the one hand, freedom of public discussion involving freedom to nibble at the foundations of capitalist society is inevitable in the long run. On the other hand, the intellectual group cannot help nibbling because it lives on criticism, and its whole position depends on criticism that stings. And criticism of persons and of current events will, in a situation in which nothing is sacrosanct, fatally issue in criticism of classes and institutions. A few strokes will complete the modern picture. There are the increasing means for the intellectual group. There is the increase in the standard of life and in the leisure of the masses that changed and is still changing the composition of the collective patron for the tastes of whom the intellectuals have to provide. There was and is the further cheapening of the book and newspaper and the large-scale newspaper concern. There is now the radio, And there was, and is, the tendency toward complete removal of restraints, steadily breaking down those short-run attempts at resistance to intellectual critique, by which bourgeois society pursues itself so incompetent and occasionally so childish a disciplinarian. There is, however, another factor empowering the intellectual group. One of the most important features of the latter stages of capitalist civilization is the vigorous expansion of the educational apparatus and particularly of the facilities for higher education. This development was, and is, no less inevitable than the development of the largest scale industrial unit, but, unlike the latter, it has been and is being fostered by public opinion and public authority so as to go much further than it would have done under its own steam. Whatever we may think of this form from other standpoints, and whatever the precise causation, there are several consequences that bear upon the size and attitude of the intellectual group. First, inasmuch as higher education thus increases the supply of services in professional, quasi-professional, and in the end-all white-collar lines, beyond the point determined by cost-return considerations, it may create a particularly important case of sectional unemployment. Second, along with or in place of such unemployment, it creates unsatisfactory conditions of employment in substandard work or at wages below those of the better paid manual workers. Third, it may create unemployability of a particularly disconcerting type. The man who has gone through a college or university easily becomes psychically unemployable in manual occupations without necessarily acquiring employability in, say, professional work. His failure to do so may be either due to a lack of natural ability, an outcome perfectly compatible with merely passing academic tests, or to inadequate teaching, and both cases will, absolutely and relatively, occur more frequently as ever larger numbers are drafted into higher education and as the required amount of teaching increases irrespective of how many teachers and scholars nature chooses to turn out. The results of neglecting this and of acting on the theory that schools, colleges, and universities are just a matter of money are too obvious to insist upon. Cases in which among a dozen applicants for a job, all formally qualified, there is not one who can fill it satisfactorily, are known to everyone who has anything to do with appointments, to everyone, that is, who is himself qualified to judge. All those who are unemployed or unsatisfactorily employed or unemployable drift into the vocations in which standards are least definite or in which aptitudes and acquirements of a different order count. They swell the host of intellectuals in the strict sense of the term, whose numbers hence increase disproportionately. They enter it in a thoroughly discontented frame of mind. Discontent breeds resentment, and it often rationalizes itself into that social criticism which, as we have seen before, is, in any case, the intellectual spectator's typical attitude toward men, classes, and institutions, especially in a rationalist and utilitarian civilization. Well, here we have numbers, a well-defined group situation of proletarian hue, and a group interest shaping a group attitude that will much more realistically account for hostility to the capitalist order than could the theory according to which the intellectual's righteous indignation about the wrongs of capitalism simply represents the logical inference from outrageous facts. Moreover, our theory also accounts for the fact that this hostility increases, instead of diminishing, with every achievement of capitalist evolution. Of course, the hostility of the intellectual group, amounting to moral disapproval of the capitalist order, is one thing, and the general hostile atmosphere which surrounds the capitalist engine is another thing. The latter is the really significant phenomenon, and it is not simply the product of the former, but flows partly from independent sources, some of which have been mentioned before. So far as it does, it is raw material for the intellectual group to work on. There are give and take relations between the two, which it would require more space to unravel than I can spare. The general contours of such an analysis are, however, sufficiently obvious, and I think it safe to repeat that the role of the intellectual group consists primarily in stimulating, energizing, verbalizing, and organizing this material, and only secondarily in adding to it. Some examples will illustrate the principle. For instance, capitalist evolution produces a labor movement, which obviously is not the creation of the intellectual group. But it is not surprising that such an opportunity and the intellectual power should find each other. Labor never craved intellectual leadership, but intellectuals invaded labor politics. They had an important contribution to make. They verbalized the movement, supplied theories and slogans for it, class war is an excellent example, made it conscious of itself, and in doing so changed its meaning. In solving this task from their own standpoint, they naturally radicalized it, eventually imparting a revolutionary bias to the most bourgeois trade union practices, a bias most of the non-intellectual labor leaders at first greatly resented. Listening to the intellectual, the workman is almost invariably conscious of an impassable gulf, if not of downright distrust. In order to get hold of the workman and to compete with non-intellectual labor leaders, the intellectual is driven to courses entirely unnecessary for the latter. Having no genuine authority and feeling always in danger of being unceremoniously told to mind his own business, the intellectual must flatter, promise and incite, nurse left wings and scowling minorities, sponsor doubtful or submarginal cases, appeal to fringe ends, profess himself ready to obey, in short, behave toward the masses as his predecessor intellectuals behaved first toward their ecclesiastical superiors, later toward princesses and other individual patrons, still later toward the collective master of bourgeois complexion. Thus, though intellectuals have not created the labor movement, they have yet worked it up into something that differs substantially from what it would be without them. The social atmosphere, for the theory of which we have been gathering stones and mortar, explains why public policy grows more and more hostile to capitalist interests, eventually so much so as to refuse on principle to take account of the requirements of the capitalist engine and to become a serious impediment to its functioning. In this regard, the intellectual group's activities have a relation to anti-capitalist policies that is more direct than what is implied in their share in verbalizing them. Intellectuals rarely enter professional politics and still more rarely conquer responsible office, but they staff political bureaus, write party pamphlets and speeches, act as secretaries and advisors, make the individual politician's newspaper reputation, which, though it is not everything, few men can afford to neglect. In doing these things, the intellectuals to some extent impress their mentality on almost everything that is being done. The actual influence exerted by the intellectual varies greatly with the state of the political game, from mere formulation to making a measure politically possible or impossible. But there is always plenty of scope for it within politics. When we say that individual politicians and parties are exponents of class interests, we are at best emphasizing one half of the truth. The other half, just as important, if not more so, comes into view when we consider that politics is a profession which involves interests of its own, interests that may clash with, as well as conform to, the interests of the groups that a man or party represents. Individual and party opinion is, more than anything else, sensitive to those factors in the political situation that directly affect the career or the standing of the individual or party. Some of these are controlled by the intellectual group in much the same sense as is the moral code of an epoch that exalts the cause of some interests and puts the cause of others tacitly out of court. Finally, that social atmosphere or code of values affects not only policies, the spirit of legislation, but also administrative practice. But again, there is also a more direct relation between the intellectual group and bureaucracy. The bureaucracies of Europe are of pre- and extra-capitalist origin. However much they may have changed in composition as the centuries rolled on, they never identified themselves wholly with the bourgeoisie, its interests, or its scheme of values, and never saw much more in it than an asset to be managed in the interest of the monarch or of the nation. Except for inhibitions due to professional training and experience, administrative bureaucracies are therefore open to conversion by the modern intellectual, with whom, through a similar education, they have much in common. While the tinge of gentility that in many cases used to raise a barrier has been fading away from the modern civil servant during the last decades. Moreover, in times of rapid expansion of the sphere of public administration, much of the additional personnel required has to be taken directly from the intellectual group. Witness this country, Germany.